Chapter 11, Biodiversity and Conservation Biology. The case study is about the Siberian tiger. You don't need to really have any sticky notes on this. It's not something you will be tested on. Turn to the next page, page 310, starting with our planet of life. Make sure you know the definition of biodiversity. Make sure you know this figure and understand the difference between ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. On page 311, under biodiversity, make sure you know the definitions of species diversity, species richness, species evenness, or relative abundance. What in the world is a species? A species, the definition of a species is that if you can mate, you're the same species. If you cannot mate or do not mate naturally in the wild, you are a different species. A subspecies is a different population in an area that looks differently but is the same species as other subspecies. For example, a subspecies has 3 Latin names. Our rattlesnake here in Santa Clarita is called the Southern Pacific rattlesnake. It is a subspecies of the western rattlesnake. The western rattlesnake is Crotalus viridis, and there's different populations of Crotalus viridis all over the western United States. Our rattlesnake here is a subspecies, and it has a 3rd name, Hilary, Crotalus viridis hilary. And what this means is that our rattlesnake could mate and produce babies with all kinds of western rattlesnakes, from Idaho to Oregon to Arizona. And so it is a western rattlesnake, but because it has special markings and lives in the chaparral and it's its own little population, we call it a subspecies, and we call it the Southern Pacific rattlesnake. On the next page, we have another example of subspecies here with the tigers. Now, tigers are all one species, and all of these different types of tigers could mate with each other and produce offspring, but because they sort of live isolated from each other and have special markings, we call them subspecies. Genetic diversity on page 312 is very important because it allows a population to withstand environmental change. So what this means is that if you've got a lot of different kinds of genes in a population, if something happens like pollution or climate change, or even some hunting or poaching that comes through, some of your members are going to have some really strong genes, and they're going to survive this change and then pass on those good genes to their offspring. And so your species and your population can withstand this change and still survive and not become extinct in that area. And that's the importance of genetic diversity. Some of your members will have good, strong genes to survive a change. Worldwide, the estimated number of species is 5 to 30 million species on the planet, and that's represented here. The most species on the planet are insects, followed by spiders, arachnids. Mammals, including humans, are pretty low in terms of the number of species. Insects make up most of the biodiversity on the planet, 3/4 of all the species. All right, biodiversity is unevenly distributed. On page 315, we have a picture here about latitudinal gradient. Make sure you know the 2 captions and the picture. So this picture basically shows that when you're by the equator, and here's Panama, and that's pretty close to the equator, you have a lot of different species of birds, 500 to 600 different species of birds down here. As you get further north, or actually further south from the equator too, into South America, your number of species, your species richness is going to decline the further north that you get until you're way up here in 50, 40, 30 different species of birds. And this concept is called latitudinal gradients. Your higher latitudes are going to have less species. Now, why are there more species down here? Because of more sun and more rain, and they support more species. On page 316, Under biodiversity loss and species extinctions, make sure you know these vocab words. Extirpation is extinct in a certain area. Not altogether, but just in an area. For example, the grizzly bear is extirpated in California. Grizzly bears are not extinct. They still exist in Wyoming and Montana and Canada and Alaska, but not in California, which is ironic because it's on our state flag. So we say it's extirpated from California. Also know background rate of extinction. Also know we've had 5 previous mass extinctions. What are these 5? They're on this chart here on page 317. Here are the 5. You need to know these 2 for your test. The Permo-Triassic was the largest mass extinction, and the Cretaceous extinction involved the dinosaurs. We have some famous extinctions in the past. These 4 birds, and these are all birds, including the auk is a bird, have become extinct, and they're quite famous for their extinctions. On the next page, we have, this is 318, we have the red list. So know what the red list is for your next exam. And then on page 319, we have the causes of species decline. The number 1 cause is habitat alteration, which sometimes we call habitat loss. And you have this piece of paper that was handed out. So you have this handout here that lists the causes of species extinction in order, with number 1 being habitat destruction. And whenever you talk about habitat destruction, be specific as to which kind if you ever have to write about it. The second biggest cause of species extinction is invasive species, and sometimes we call them non-native or exotic or alien. The third major cause of extinction or species becoming endangered is illegal hunting and poaching. Then we have the exotic pet and decorative plant trade. Some animals like parrots at the pet store were captured in the wild. Think of the movie Rio. You have the blue parrot being captured. Air, soil, and water pollution is number 5, and global warming is the 6th leading cause of species decline and extinction. Species are categorized as one of these, going from common to rare to threatened, endangered, and extinct. Some zoos will list which one of these they are when you're at an enclosure. On this page, sometimes FRQs ask, well, what makes certain species more vulnerable to extinction? If you have some sort of environmental change like pollution or climate change, why do some species decline and some do not? And here are the reasons. Some of them have specialized feeding behavior, like polar bears hunt off the icebergs. If the ice disappears, what are they going to eat? And so they're more vulnerable because they're specialists. Generalists don't have as much of a problem. If you require a large territory and your habitat is lost to development or agriculture or deforestation, you won't have enough territory to hunt. If an invasive species moves in and you have no natural defense and you're getting killed off by invasive species, and you're more vulnerable because you have no natural defense, you can decline. Some species are endemic. They're only in one place on the planet. And if something happens, for example, the unarmored 3-spined stickleback fish lives only in our river out here in Santa Clarita. If somebody illegally dumps a bunch of chemicals in that river and kills off this fish, then it becomes extinct because it doesn't live anywhere else. Case strategists are slow to reproduce. For example, some animals have been hunted and hunted and hunted, but they keep coming back in population, like deer and elk. But some animals were hunted, like whales, and they haven't come back because they are really, really slow to reproduce. So even though whaling is banned, decades ago, whales are still endangered because they only reproduce, one baby whale every few years. On the next page, we have some charts of invasive species here. And you have 12 on the chart. You need to know 5 of them: zebra mussels, kudzu, cane toad, gypsy moths, and brown tree snakes. make sure when you're studying for your next test that you read the descriptions under here of these 5 so that you understand about these 5. The next page has an article about biological indicators. They indicate whether, these are species that indicate whether an ecosystem is in good shape or if it's degraded. Now, birds are really good indicator species because birds are mainly generalists. They eat a bunch of food. They can live in a lot of places. And when they start to decline and disappear, then that's an indicator to scientists that there's some sort of environmental degradation going on in that ecosystem. Amphibians are also really good indicators because they live in both water and on land, and they absorb water in their skin. And so if you have pollution in the water, pollution on land, the amphibians are going to decline, and that can lead to extinction. Amphibians are declining worldwide through pesticides, herbicides, predators, and parasites. Those are eyes right here. Page 324. We have here the benefits of biodiversity. So on this paper that I just went over, on the back side, we have a list of why do we need species. And it says here, make sure you can describe 2 to 3 of these on an AP FRQ. We have a whole list here of 11 reasons why we should save species. Why should we spend all this effort to save species? They're essential to ecosystems. They provide genetic reserves, medical benefits, recreational benefits for our culture, for aesthetic like pictures and movies and enjoyment and hiking, food resources, just because they exist, science, economic goods for our future generations. So make sure you know about all 11 of these and can describe, not just list, but describe these. So read through these. It's very important to be able to answer an FRQ about this. So your book also talks about this, the benefits of biodiversity. Biodiversity provides ecosystem services, things that nature gives to humans that have an economic value. Food, fuel, fiber, those are all economic values to humans. They all come from nature. Shelter and building materials, purifying air and water, decomposing waste. These are all, again, economic, monetary values that nature gives us. Also on this page, know that the 2 ecosystem engineers are ants and worms. You also need to know that the more biodiversity in an ecosystem, you have more stability and you have more resilience to change. And we've been over these 2 terms before in chapters 6. At the bottom, we have a review of some of your top predators. Again, some review from when we studied ecology in chapter 6. Top predators are often keystone species. They are frequently hunted. They need large areas of habitat, and they are vulnerable to the buildup of toxins through something called biomagnification, which we'll discuss more in chapter 14. Page 326. Make sure you know the definition of food security. The more biodiversity, the more food security. And this list shows some potential food sources. We could eat all of these things. We could breed these animals. We could grow these crops and eat them. We don't. There's no reason why we don't at this time, but we could. The rosy periwinkle is a famous plant that fights cancer. So make sure you know about the rosy periwinkle, which is described on this page. On the next page, we have the definition of ecotourism, so make sure that you study and read about it as well when you're studying. Don't just look at this and go, oh, hey, ecotourism, but make sure that you know about ecotourism as one of the benefits of biodiversity. On page 328, we have a couple definitions that you need to know: biophilia and nature deficit disorder.